You know, the moments that truly change this country don't always announce themselves with a bang. Sometimes they slip in quietly. And by the time most folks realize what happened, the ground has already shifted underneath them. I believe we are living through one of those moments right now. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched nearly 900 joint airstrikes against Iran. Command infrastructure, missile sites, air defenses, and the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ham, was killed. Most Americans heard that and thought, decisive, strong. Maybe this finally resolves the Iran problem. But here's what wasn't on the front page yet. Within 72 hours, Iran declared the Strait of Hormuz closed and attacked ships that tried to pass. 20 million barrels of oil a day moved through that waterway, 1/5 of the world's seaborne crude, and it went dark. Now, here's the part we'll come back to in a moment because it tells you everything about what went wrong in the planning of this. Iran didn't shut down Hormuz with a naval blockade. They launched a handful of drone strikes nearby, and the global insurance industry pulled coverage on every tanker. Without insurance, shipping companies wouldn't sail. An insurance crisis shut down the most important energy corridor on Earth. I don't say this to score political points. I say it because when you launch a war, and let's be honest, that's what this is, you don't just own the first strike. You own everything after. The gas prices, the grocery bills, the 7 American lives already lost, the alliance damage across the Gulf, the oil fields Iraq is shutting down because it can't export anymore. The question is whether the leaders who made this decision truly prepared for what would follow, and whether our institutions did their job demanding accountability before the first missile was ever launched. From where I'm sitting, the early evidence is deeply troubling, and that's what I want to walk through with you. Now look, before we go any further, I want to make sure everybody understands what we're really talking about here, because the Strait of Hormuz isn't just a line on a map. It is the single most consequential energy choke point on this planet. Picture a narrow waterway, 21 miles wide at its tightest point, with Iran on one side and Oman on the other. Every day, roughly 20 million barrels of crude oil and about 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas exports pass through that corridor. It connects the Persian Gulf, where Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE produce their oil, to the open ocean and the global market. I can tell you from my years in office, every president since Jimmy Carter has understood this strait as a red line in global stability. During my administration, we maintained the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain specifically to keep those waters open. We ran dual containment against Iraq and Iran, with the Strait of Hormuz always in the back of our minds, because we understood if Hormuz closes, you don't just have an energy crisis. You have an economic earthquake that hits every gas station in America, every factory in Europe, every power grid in Asia. And this is where things start to get complicated, because for 50 years, Iran threatened to close this strait and never did. It was always the hypothetical nightmare, the scenario you war-gamed but prayed you'd never see. Well, it's not hypothetical anymore. And here's what concerns me most. This didn't happen because Iran attacked us out of nowhere. It happened as a direct, predictable consequence of an offensive military campaign, a war of choice aimed at regime change. Every serious strategic thinker in Washington knew that if you hit Iran hard enough, Hormuz was the leverage they'd use. That wasn't a surprise. It was a certainty. So the question becomes, if everybody knew this was coming, why does it feel like nobody planned for it? Let me walk you through this carefully, because the sequence matters. February 28th, the U.S. and Israel launched joint airstrikes on Iran. The stated goal, regime change. Supreme Leader Khamenei is killed. By March 1st, Iran retaliates with drone strikes against U.S. bases in the Gulf. 6 American Army reservists are killed at Port Shuya in Kuwait. A 7th, Sergeant Benjamin Pennington, 26 years old, dies days later from injuries sustained at a base in Saudi Arabia. By March 2nd, Iran declares the Strait of Hormuz closed and attacks ships attempting passage. Not with a traditional blockade, with targeted drone strikes that spook the global insurance market and to pulling coverage. Tanker traffic drops to nearly zero, 16 million barrels per day, stranded behind the strait, cut off from the world. And this is where the dominoes start falling. Oil prices post their largest weekly surge since 1985. Brent crude briefly hits $119 a barrel on March 9th before settling around $89 after Trump suggested the war could end soon. Gas prices in the U.S. jumped from $2.94 a gallon to $347 within a week, the largest daily spike in 4 years. Iraq began shutting down oil fields because it literally has nowhere to store crude it can no longer export. Meanwhile, Iran strikes energy infrastructure in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE, meaning even alternate export routes are now at risk. The Houthis resume attacks in the Red Sea, creating a dual choke point crisis. Iran names KA's son, Moshaba, as new supreme leader. France announces independent escort plans. The G7 meets to discuss strategic reserve releases but holds off. Trump offers naval escorts and government-backed insurance through the DFC. But experts are skeptical. The DFC has a finite budget, legal constraints, and slow approval processes. As one analyst put it, it's a war zone. Boats are going to sink. That's not a recovery plan, that's a hope. Now look, I want to be fair here. I'm not going to pretend that Iran wasn't a real threat. It was. The nuclear program, the proxy network stretching from Lebanon to Yemen, the missile capability, all of that was serious. Every president since Carter has had to manage it. I certainly did. And I'll tell you this, there were moments in the Situation Room where the option of military force was on the table. We looked at it, we studied it, and more than once we chose a different path. Not because we were weak, but because we understood that the day after matters as much as the day of. That's what concerns me about how this was handled. When you launch nearly 900 airstrikes aimed at regime change, when you kill a head of state and decapitate a government, you are setting in motion a chain of consequences that no amount of bravado can control. You own the oil shock. You own the 7 American lives lost. You own the 340 settler gas prices hitting families in Ohio and Mississippi who had nothing to do with this decision. You own Iraq's oil fields shutting down because crude has nowhere to go. You own the drone strikes on Saudi refineries and Qatari gas plants, our partners, our allies now under fire because of a war they didn't choose. And here's what really gets me. The insurance-driven shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz, the single most predictable consequence of hitting Iran hard, appears to have caught the White House off guard. The DFC insurance gambit, let me tell you something about that. The Development Finance Corporation has a finite budget, slow approval processes, and legal constraints that were never designed to underwrite all of maritime commerce through a war zone. One analyst said it plainly, boats are going to sink. That's not a strategy, that's an afterthought. When I chose not to invade Iraq in the 90s, when we calibrated the Kosovo intervention with a coalition and a plan for the day after, it wasn't because we lacked resolve. It was because responsible leadership means measuring the full cost before you act. There's a difference between strategic strength and strategic recklessness. And when you choose war, you own everything that follows, and you'd better have a plan for all of it. Now, the oil prices and the gas prices, those are real and they hurt. But I want to talk about something that doesn't show up on a price chart. And in some ways, it worries me even more. I'm talking about the institutional damage. Start with Congress. The Constitution is pretty clear about who has the authority to take this country to war. And yet here we are, 10 days into a regime change campaign, 7 American service members dead, the largest oil supply disruption in history, and Congress never voted to authorize it. Democrats pushed a war powers resolution in the House. It failed 219 to 212. 4 Democrats, Golden, Cuellar, Landsman, and Vargas, voted with Republicans to kill it. In the Senate, it couldn't even get to a vote. Republicans frame the resolution as waving a white flag. Now, I understand the politics of that, but the War Powers Act exists for a reason. It exists because we learned painfully in Vietnam that a president sending Americans into combat without the deliberative consent of the people's representatives is a danger to the republic itself. And it's not just Congress. Look at our alliances: Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, countries that host American bases, that buy American weapons, that have been partners in stabilizing the Gulf for decades. They are now being struck by Iranian missiles and drones. Iran hit a Saudi refinery. It launched its largest ever drone barrage against Qatar. The UAE has suffered 4 deaths and over 100 injuries. France is now sending 10 warships, including the Charles de Gaulle carrier, to escort ships independently because our allies don't trust that we can manage the security environment we created. The Houthis have announced they'll resume Red Sea attacks, threatening a dual choke point crisis. Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb at the same time. That's the nightmare scenario for global trade. And the Democratic Party itself is fractured. Senators like Murphy and Warner calling this a war of choice, while members like Fetterman supported the strikes. When the institutions designed to check executive power can't function, when alliances built over decades fray in days, the damage goes far deeper than any barrel of oil. Let me tell you something. The price of gasoline is the most democratic thing in America. Everybody pays it. The single mother in Detroit, the farmer in Kansas, the truck driver running routes through Appalachia. When gas jumps 14% in a single week from $2.94 to $347 a gallon because of a war that wasn't debated, wasn't authorized by Congress, and wasn't adequately planned for. People feel it and they don't forget. Now here's the political landscape as I see it. The president said on Monday, 10 days into this war, that it's very complete pretty much. He said Iran has no navy, no communications, no air force, and maybe that's true in a narrow military sense. But the Strait of Hormuz is still closed. Oil crossed 110 a barrel today. Iraq's southern oil production has collapsed by 70%. Kuwait is cutting output. Energy Secretary Chris Wright says the price spike will last weeks, not months, but he can't guarantee that. And everybody knows it. There's a credibility gap forming, and it's dangerous for both parties. Republicans own this war. If it ends quickly and cleanly, they'll claim vindication. But if the strait stays closed, if gas pushes toward $5 or $6, if European and Asian economies tip into recession, if American casualties mount, then they own all of that too. And the very complete line will follow them the way mission accomplished followed another administration. Democrats, frankly, aren't in a much better position. The party is divided. It can't offer a unified alternative. The War Powers vote exposed the fault. Line between members who supported the strikes and those who see this as reckless overreach. And that division makes it nearly impossible to hold the administration accountable in a coherent way. The real danger here, and I've seen this before, is that a generational policy crisis gets treated like a media cycle. This isn't a news story that fades in 2 weeks. The decisions being made right now will shape energy markets, alliance structures, and American credibility for years to come. Now, I'm not a fortune teller, but I've been around long enough to know that when you're dealing with a crisis this large, you'd better think clearly about where it goes from here. So let me lay out the realistic scenarios. The first possibility, call it the optimistic case, is a quick resolution. The president's claim that the war is very complete proves accurate. Iran's conventional military is destroyed. A diplomatic channel opens. The strait reopens within 2 to 3 weeks. Oil falls back towards 70 or 80. Gas prices stabilize, and America moves on. I'd give that maybe a 20 to 25% chance. And even if it happens, the president of an unauthorized regime change war still stands. That doesn't just go away. The second scenario is a prolonged closure. The strait stays shut for weeks or months. Oil pushes past $130. Macquarie Research says $150 is realistic if this drags on. Gas rises toward $5, $6, maybe $7 a gallon. Iraq's shooting production climbs toward 3.8 million barrels per day. Kuwait follows. Saudi Arabia could be weeks away from running out of storage. Global inflation spikes. Europe and Asia, which depend heavily on Gulf energy, tip into recession. The U.S. draws down the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which, by the way, is already at historically low levels, weakening our long-term energy security for a short-term fix. The third scenario, and this is the one that keeps me up at night, is escalation. Iran strikes on Gulf infrastructure. Don't just disrupt supply temporarily. They damage production capacity that takes months or years to rebuild. The conflict draws in more actors. The Houthis resume Red Sea attacks in force, creating a dual choke point. American casualties mount. The humanitarian toll inside Iran, a country of 88 million people, deepens into a generational crisis. We've been here before. We've seen what happens when you break a country and don't have a plan to rebuild it. Iraq, 2003. The lesson was right there, and I'm worried we didn't learn it. You know, in all my years in public life, through the good decisions and the ones I'd handled differently, through the crises that tested us and the moments that brought us together, I always came back to one belief. The strength of this country was never just our military. It was never just our economy. It was our ability to make decisions together through our institutions with our eyes open and our values intact. That's what's being tested right now. We are 10 days into a war that Congress never authorized, that has produced the largest oil supply disruption in history, that has cost 7 American lives, that has fractured our alliances across the Gulf, and that has sent the price of energy, the lifeblood of every household in this country, surging to levels we haven't seen in years. And the question isn't just what happens next with Iran. The question is whether we still have the institutional discipline to course correct when things go wrong. I believe we do. But it requires something from all of us. It requires that Congress assert its constitutional role, not as a partisan exercise, but as a democratic obligation. It requires that leaders communicate honestly with the American people about the costs and risks of military action rather than declaring victory while the strait is still closed and oil is above $110 a barrel. It requires rebuilding the alliances that have been strained with France now, sending its own fleet because it can't rely on ours. And it requires that we as citizens demand accountability, not next year, not at the ballot box in some distant election, but now. We've survived oil shocks before. We've corrected course after strategic mistakes before. But we only did it when the American people engaged, when institutions functioned, and when leaders chose wisdom over impulse, strategy over bravado, and accountability over spin. The answer doesn't come from Washington alone. It comes from you. It always has. And I still believe, even in a moment as troubling as this one, that America can get this right. But only if we remember who we